Senator Kaine, please.
Thank you to our witnesses for your service. I want to return to the heartbreaking tragedy in Israel and Gaza. Israel, of course, must defend itself against those who would annihilate it. No one asked the question about whether the United States had a right to defend itself after 9/11. Israel has that right, and that would include Hamas. It would include Hezbollah. It would include Iran. It would include militias connected to Iran. It would include the Houthis. But in the days after the October 7 attack, I offered this advice to the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Herzog: learn from our own mistakes and confine your vigorous defense to a defense against Hamas, and don't let it look like it's a war against Gazans or Palestinians, who are not the same as Hamas, who often are under the thumb of Hamas. I gave advice to the ambassador then that the world would be watching to see what happened, and there's various bits of evidence that you look at to determine whether this is a defense against Hamas or whether it's a war against Gazans or Palestinians. First, the extent of civilian casualties. The civilian casualties in this war have been heartbreaking, and yet, because Hamas chooses to embed with civilian populations, it's extremely difficult to defend against Hamas without that heartbreak. Second, how you talk about the war. Are you talking about it as a war against Hamas, or are you more broadly talking about it as a war against all Gazans or Palestinians? In the weeks after the October 7 attack, yes, there was trauma. You don't necessarily say the most precise thing when you're traumatized, but there were too many statements from Israeli leadership, the president, the defense minister, suggesting we're going to shut off all water, all food, all everything into Gaza, collectively punishing Gazans who are not necessarily part of Hamas. That is unfortunate. Third, the allowance of humanitarian aid. 500 trucks a day were supplying the needs of these 2 million people into Gaza. Aid was throttled off immediately. Water was turned off. Just 2 days ago, the amount of aid into Gaza hit 300 trucks. And yesterday, it got near 500 trucks 6 months into this. If you are not allowing what you were allowing before, food and medicine, to get to a civilian population, you're making the situation worse, not better. There's no reason the United States should have to build a pier in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's no reason we should have to airdrop supplies, often endangering people who have to go out into the water and get them. I applaud the president for convincing, finally, Prime Minister Netanyahu to open the crossing from Erez after it took months to get them to open the crossing from Kerem Shalom. But the pace of humanitarian aid is insufficient. The widow of our former chair, Senator McCain, Cindy McCain, said 2 days ago that we are on the verge of a catastrophic famine in Gaza, and we may not be able to recover. If you wanted to maintain a vigorous war against Hamas but not against Palestinians, you'd protect Palestinians from violence on the West Bank. It was shocking to me to hear reports from our own U.S. military officials that settlers' violence against Palestinians on the West Bank is not only increasing, but in many instances, the violence is accompanied by escorts from IDF reservists and Israeli border officials who are protecting settlers committing violence against Palestinians. My understanding is that the escort phenomenon has abated, but the violence against Palestinians on the West Bank has not. And finally, if you wanted to make plain that it was a war against Gaza, not against Palestinians, you would hold out some hope to Palestinians that they might have a future of autonomy as they were promised in 1948. The world made a promise to two people in 1948, that there would be a state of Israel and a state of Palestine living side by side peacefully. One promise the world has kept, one promise the world hasn't kept. There's a million reasons for that. But the fact is, 75 years later, one promise has been kept and one hasn't. And it's important for Palestinians to believe they might have a future with autonomy that might look different than 1948, but they should believe it. Instead, Israeli leadership in their statements has essentially closed that off. It is so very important that we provide assistance to Israel to allow itself to defend against those who would annihilate it. It is so very important that we take dramatically more steps to encourage Israel, to push Israel, to urge Israel and other nations to make plain that a war against Gazans or Palestinians is going to make this worse. Cindy McCain predicts that there will be a famine, a mass famine in Gaza. Secretary Austin, if that were to occur, if women and children who are already dying but start to die in great numbers because of lack of access to food or medicine, will that improve Or will that de-escalate the violence in the region, or will that accelerate violence in the region?
It will accelerate violence, and it will have the effect of ensuring that there's a long-term conflict because of, the Palestinian people have been disadvantaged to such a great degree. This doesn't have to happen. I think to your point, I think we should continue to do everything we can, and we are doing this to encourage the Israelis to provide humanitarian assistance, to open up more land routes, and to separate the Palestinian people from Hamas. Failure to do so, I think, would just create more terror.
I'm going to close. You'd say we already see dangerous escalation. The U.S. has had to wage 460 strikes against the Houthis, who are firing into the Red Sea. They weren't really doing that in any significant quantity until the war in Gaza started. And the U.S. has put our own personnel on high alert in the Middle East because there's the expectation that Iran will retaliate against Israel for an Iranian attack on for an Israeli attack on Iranian positions in Syria. We've got to find a path to de-escalation here. The world is depending on us to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kaine.